the influence no one voted for. Power does not always announce itself through elections, speeches, or laws. Sometimes it arrives quietly, shaping outcomes without ever appearing on a ballot. Inside the White House, some of the most consequential influence belongs to someone no one ever voted for. This matters now more than ever. In an age of visible polarization and constant scrutiny, it's easy to assume power is obvious. That it lives in public offices and formal titles. But the modern presidency operates within a far more complex reality. Decisions are rarely shaped by a single voice. They are molded by forces that exist just outside public view, influencing what is possible long before choices reach the president's desk. To understand this influence, we have to look beyond official authority. Beyond cabinet meetings and press briefings. Inside the White House, power often comes from proximity, trust, and timing. From who controls information flow. From who frames problems before solutions are ever discussed. These dynamics don't appear in transcripts, but they quietly define outcomes. At first, this influence seems harmless. Advisors exist for a reason. Expertise matters. Guidance is necessary. But over time, patterns form. Certain perspectives dominate. Certain risks are emphasized while others fade. The president begins each day not with raw reality, but with reality filtered through someone else's judgment. This is where the story begins. Not with corruption or conspiracy, but with structure. With how modern governance actually functions under pressure. The White House is an environment of speed, uncertainty, and overload. No leader can see everything. So influence fills the gaps. Early signs are subtle. A memo summarized instead of shared. A briefing reordered. A question never raised because it might slow momentum. None of it feels dramatic. All of it feels efficient. And that efficiency slowly becomes power. The most influential figures are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who decide what reaches the room at all. They don't argue for decisions. They shape the field of options so thoroughly that the decision feels inevitable by the time it's made. The president may hold authority, but influence works differently. It does not command. It suggests. It frames. It narrows. And once it does, even the strongest leaders find themselves choosing between paths already shaped by someone else's hand. This is not a story about betrayal. It's a story about modern power. About how leadership is influenced long before it is exercised. And about the forces inside the Oval Office that shape history without ever asking for permission. Because sometimes, the most powerful influence in the room is the one no one ever voted for. Once influence establishes itself, it rarely feels intrusive. It feels helpful. Inside the White House, where information moves faster than reflection, the person who simplifies complexity becomes indispensable. Over time, that indispensability turns into quiet authority. This influence grows not through instruction, but through repetition. The same individual becomes the first to brief, the last to summarize, the one trusted to highlight what truly matters. Gradually, their interpretation becomes the baseline. Other perspectives exist, but they arrive later, framed as secondary or reactive. The president may never consciously grant this power. It emerges naturally from proximity and reliability. In moments of crisis, when seconds matter and uncertainty overwhelms, leaders lean toward what feels familiar. The voice that has consistently delivered clarity begins to shape urgency itself. What makes this dynamic so powerful is its invisibility. There are no formal limits placed on influence of this kind. No confirmation hearings. No term limits. Its strength lies in trust, and trust is not regulated. It is earned slowly, and once earned, it is rarely questioned until something goes wrong. As days turn into months, the influence deepens. Meetings are scheduled around availability. Briefings are prepared with certain expectations in mind. Alternatives that complicate momentum quietly disappear. Not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt the established rhythm of decision-making. Other advisors notice it. Some push back subtly. Others adapt. Over time, dissent becomes quieter, not out of fear, but out of efficiency. Raising objections feels unnecessary when the direction already seems set. Influence has done its work before debate even begins. This is how power moves without confrontation, without command, without visibility. It reshapes what leadership perceives as reality. By the time decisions are made, they feel self-evident, logical, unavoidable. And that is the danger. When influence becomes structure, questioning it feels like questioning the system itself. The president still decides, but the field of decision has been narrowed by someone whose authority was never defined. The Oval Office is not immune to this dynamic. In fact, it may be uniquely vulnerable to it. Because the greater the pressure, the more leadership depends on filters. And when those filters belong to someone no one voted for, influence quietly becomes power. The conflict emerges when influence begins to shape outcomes more than intent. Not through malice, but through momentum. The individual at the center of this dynamic does not need to persuade. The structure does that for them. By the time options reach the president, the debate has already been decided upstream. Advisors sense it when their recommendations are consistently reframed. Not rejected outright, just softened, delayed, deferred until urgency passes. Over time, they stop offering certain ideas altogether. Not because they are wrong, but because they no longer fit the prevailing narrative of what is realistic. The president feels it differently. Decisions start to feel easier, faster, cleaner. Fewer competing voices. Fewer unresolved tensions. That efficiency is seductive. It creates the illusion of clarity in an environment built on uncertainty. But clarity achieved this way often masks loss. The real conflict is not personal. It is structural. Influence without accountability reshapes incentives. The person who controls framing is never forced to defend outcomes publicly. When decisions succeed, credit flows upward. When they fail, responsibility rests with the president. Influence remains untouched. This imbalance deepens quietly. The more the president relies on a trusted filter, the more that filter becomes indispensable. Removing it feels risky. Challenging it feels disruptive. And so the influence persists, not because it is perfect, but because the system has adapted around it. Tension rises when consequences appear. A decision produces unexpected fallout. A blind spot becomes visible. Advisors trace the path backward and realize certain warnings never reached the room. Certain alternatives were never considered. The influence did not force a mistake. It shaped the conditions that made it likely. At this point, leadership faces a difficult truth. The problem is not one person. It is the architecture of trust that allowed influence to operate unchecked. Confronting it means accepting that efficiency came at the cost of perspective. The conflict reaches its peak when the president must decide whether to preserve comfort or restore friction. Because friction, though frustrating, is what keeps systems honest. Removing it may feel like progress, but it often signals imbalance. Influence has now reached its limit. Not because it has failed, but because its success has narrowed vision too far. The Oval Office stands at a crossroads 97 between continuing a system that feels smooth and disrupting it to regain depth. And in that moment, leadership must confront a question rarely asked aloud. Who is really shaping the decisions made in this room? The resolution does not come from removal or confrontation. It comes from recalibration. The president chooses not to sever influence, but to surround it. New voices are elevated. Alternative briefings are encouraged. Friction is reintroduced deliberately, not as chaos, but as balance. Inside the White House, the shift is subtle but unmistakable. Meetings take longer. Disagreements surface earlier. Decisions feel heavier again. That weight is not inefficiency. It is perspective returning to the process. Influence still exists, but it no longer operates alone. The individual who once shaped outcomes invisibly now operates within a broader field. Their insights remain valuable, but they are no longer definitive. Authority is redistributed not through punishment, but through structure. The system corrects itself by widening the lens. This moment rarely makes headlines. There is no scandal, no firing, no dramatic pivot. And yet, it may be one of the most important acts of leadership a president can take. Not asserting dominance, but restoring balance. Not eliminating trust, but preventing it from becoming dependency. The lesson is uncomfortable, but essential. Modern power does not always concentrate through ambition. It concentrates through convenience, through reliability, through the human desire for clarity under pressure. And without intention, that concentration becomes invisible governance. The Oval Office will always rely on influence. It cannot function without it. But leadership demands awareness of where influence becomes control, and where efficiency becomes erosion. The strongest presidents are not those who eliminate unseen forces, but those who keep them in view. Because democracy does not fail only through force or fraud. Sometimes, it drifts. Quietly. Through structures that feel helpful until they quietly shape everything. The influence no one voted for did not disappear. It was placed back into context. And in doing so, the presidency reclaimed something more valuable than speed. It reclaimed perspective. Subscribe to join the journey.